This is a webinar to promote best practice in applying triggers and workflow automation to improve IBM I business processes. This presentation is a joint Utilities 400 and Ask Bob production. Utilities 400 are a premier IBM I ISV that specialise in developing robust integration and intelligent solutions. Ask Bob, or Ask Best of Breed for IBM Power I, is a newly formed group of best-of-breed IBM I business partners, consultants and ISVs providing advice and best practice through knowledge, experience and a range of best-in-class solutions and services. My name is Andrew Nicholson and I'll be your host for today's event. I'm joined today by industry stalwart and IBM I expert Steve Close, who will thankfully be guiding you through all the techie stuff. Welcome to the webinar, Steve.
Thanks, Andy. I'm not sure I like the stalwart word, but...
So before we start, first a little bit of housekeeping. On the right of your screen, you should see the webinar control panel. I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions as we rattle through today's presentation. So please could I direct you to the questions panel and ask you to post all your questions to the presenter and Steve in here. We'll take care to answer these at the end of the webinar. Speaking of which, what are you going to see today? Well, triggers are one of the most underused features on the IBM I operating system. And should you not be exploiting its potential, you're missing out. But are they easy to implement? How much resource do they take? And where can we go with this technology? Well, in this presentation, we'll demonstrate how you can execute a trigger whenever a record is added, updated, deleted, or read from a file. On trigger, we'll call a program to perform additional business logic. We'll implement and activate workflows through simple rules. We'll streamline manual process through implementing easy IBM I automation. We'll guide you through useful tricks, tips, and shortcuts and introduce exclusive technology that will help improve your business processes through integrated rules-based automation. So get your notepad out, pull up a chair and your green screen, and pour yourself a cup of coffee. We hope you enjoy the webinar. So let me pass you over immediately to Steve, who in this first part will be introducing triggers, how to add, amend and use them with good use. Following this section, we'll introduce you to advanced functionalities such as tiered workflows, virtual terminals and automated data input from external sources. All very interesting. But for now, it's over to you, Steve. Steve, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Andy. As Andy said in his introduction, triggers are one of the most underused parts of the IBM I operating system. Certainly in my experience when I've been around lots of sites, not many, if any, of our customers actually use them. So what are they and what can they do? Well, a trigger is basically an action that can occur. You can add to a file so that whenever a record gets added, updated, deleted, or would you believe even when a record is read from a file, you can cause some other action to occur. Okay. Now why would you want to use triggers? Well, a couple of reasons. There's quite a lot of reasons. One of them is because it is so much easier to add functionality to an existing system without having to worry about all the implications of changing your existing ERP systems. You can just say, when this action happens on this file, I want this also to happen. It's also a really good way of implementing business rules outside your applications. For instance, you can say, if we ever receive an order from somebody and it's less than £200, we always want to apply a £10 delivery charge. Okay, your application might not do that, and it might be in hundreds of places within your ERP system, but just by adding a trigger to your order file, you could make that rule apply, i.e. the trigger program itself would automatically add onto your order a delivery charge if the value is under a certain amount. We're going to talk about a few more examples as we go through the webinar. First one, I'm going to show you exactly what you do to make a trigger work. Okay, I'm going to show you the green screen where you can do it through the GUI, IBM GUI if you want to as well. I just find this methodology a bit easier. So to add a trigger to a file, which is the first thing you need to do to make a trigger active, obviously, is there's a command called add pftrg, add physical file trigger. Okay, now the pf there is quite key, physical file, because triggers are always added to a physical file. But a trigger will occur however the record is processed. So whether that's processed through a logical file or whether it's processed through a physical file, whether you process it through an SQL view, whichever program or routine updates it, the trigger will always get executed. To just give you a little more information about the methodology for adding a trigger to a file, this is the add physical file trigger command. Okay. So the first thing you need to specify is which file you want to add the trigger to. Okay, so at the top there we are saying I'm going to add a trigger to a file called customer, and that's in a library called show me demo. So what I'm trying to do here is monitor any changes to my customer file. Now the next box says when do you want the trigger to occur, the trigger time. The two values there are before and after. Now what you're doing here is when you add a trigger to a file, any logic that is actioned in the trigger program that runs will actually become part of the I/O to the file itself. Okay, so as far as the database is concerned, it's all part of the update or the add or whatever to the file that's going to occur. Now what you're defining here in this box is when you want this logic to apply. I do want it to apply before it updates the database records or adds the database records, or do I want it to apply after it's updated the database records? Okay, now the next box there says, okay, when the trigger occurs, what do I want to do? I'm going to call a program, which is the most common thing to do. Now I've written a demonstration program, especially for this webinar today, called Demo Trig 1, which resides in my library. I'm going to show you shortly a snapshot of that program, exactly what it's going to do. Okay, now the trigger box down there is where you can give the trigger a name. Now this name is purely for reference within your own applications really. So if you want to add a trigger, you give it a name, and then if you want to take the trigger off the file, you give it that same name again to take it off. Okay. I always find it useful in that trigger description to put a text exactly what it's going to do. So this is an insert trigger for file customer in library show me demo. Now down the bottom of the screen there is quite an interesting parameter. That says allow repeated change. What does that mean? Well, if you envisage the fact that when a trigger occurs on a file, that trigger will cause your program to be invoked and it will execute that program. If you set this allow repeated change parameter to *yes, that means that the trigger program that is called will also be allowed to update the file that initiated the trigger. Okay. Now when that happens, of course, then the trigger will get fired again. So you've got to be very, very careful if you do put *yes in there, that your logic can cope with the fact that a trigger will update the file, which will call another trigger, which might update the same file. Make sure you don't get yourself in a loop. So unless you really know what you're doing, leave that repeated change value to *no, i.e. if your trigger program tries to update the same file that's fired the trigger in the first place, it will fail and you'll get an error message. Now on the second screen here, unless you're into multi-threaded jobs, which is probably beyond the scope of this webinar, the only thing that's interesting there is the bottom parameter which says trigger update condition. Now the default of that is set to start always. Now what that means is whenever an application program or any application actually issues an update to that file, that means the trigger will occur. It may be that you have an application that updates a record in the file, but no data has ever changed. Okay. And in this case, it would be advantageous to change that parameter to say *change. And I cannot honestly think of any reason why you wouldn't want to do that. Basically, that means I only want the trigger to fire if the data itself has changed, irrespective of whether the program has tried to update the record. If it updates the record with the same data that was there before, if you've got *always, the trigger will happen. If you've got *change, it won't. Okay. Now, that can be quite useful. If you imagine an application I was involved in when we first generated triggers, it was a sales ledger, accounts payable type application. And every night we had a job that went through and recalculated the customer balances for tens of thousands of customers. So the first thing this program did when it started running is it went through all the customer master records and set the balance to 0. And then it went through all the transactions and added them up and updated the customer balance record of what it was. Now, 90% of these records were probably 0 in the first place. So we were getting tens of thousands of triggers occurring, which we didn't really need to process. So if we started to start change, the triggers wouldn't have occurred. It would only do the trigger when the change occurs. So it's just a little bit of efficiency. Okay, now that sounds reasonably straightforward so far. I've added a trigger to a file, and I've written a program that performs the logic. So far, so good, and so far, so easy. Now then, there are a few problems with this technique, what we call gotchas. Excuse me. Gotcha number 1, as it says there, is to add this trigger to a file, you need to get an exclusive lock on the file. You need to be able to add or remove the trigger. Okay. Now that probably means you're not going to be able to add a trigger to your order header file during the day because it's always going to be in use. Okay, you could get everybody off at lunchtime, I suppose, and do it the old-fashioned way. But it's a bit of a pain. So our customers have devised 3 different solutions to this, really. Number 1, you log on late at night, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, just before or when after your backup starts, and add the trigger yourself manually. One of the most common paths that people have taken, we've talked about this, is they simply give up. They can't do it. They'll put the trigger another way. Or the third solution, which is the one that makes more sense, and the one that we always try and encourage people to do, is instead of adding the trigger manually there and then when you want to do it, you write a little application that will perform the add remove triggers. Okay. So during the day, if you want to start triggering your order header file, what you do is you have a little application that you type into this thing, I want to start triggering my file order header in this library, and I want it to start tonight. Okay, and then you have a program that will run at some time of the night, before or after your backup or when the machine's not being used, where it can just process those files, and it will add or remove any triggers with any attributes that you've specified in the little application that you've written. So that will get you over that problem. So I'm just waiting for the screen to catch up with you now, with me. Now the second gotcha, and this is quite an interesting one that people don't realize, and they didn't realize when we started doing it. Once you've got a trigger, a program attached to a file, and this trigger has been fired, and it's updated, a record's got updated or added, and it has called the program that is part of your trigger is then allocated to that job, and that program is exclusively allocated to that job. So it's got a read-only lock on the file. And what that means is you cannot then change that program during the day. So if you wanted to change the trigger program to add some more functionality to it or to change the logic, again, you've got the same problem. You're going to have to get everybody to log off the system so you can recompile that program. The compiler doesn't do what it normally does and moves your old object into QRUPL object. It will actually fail and say, I can't get a lock on this program. The operators will not let you move it without getting everybody off that's actually used that trigger. So how do you get around that? Well, our solution is you write a generic trigger program. Okay, you have one program that is always called by any trigger that will ever run anywhere on your system. What that means is when that trigger program, once that trigger program is correct and the logic is right and it runs properly, you will never ever need to change it. And that trigger program obviously then needs to have some rules in it so it knows which the logic program is that you've just written to handle the trigger. Okay. The beauty of that is the program that's attached to the trigger has a lock. Any programs that it calls doesn't. So you can then happily recompile any programs that the trigger program calls during the day when nobody's using it. Hope that makes sense.
Okay, and if you have any questions on that, please post them in the questions panel. We'll be happy to answer them at the end of the webinar.
Okay, gotcha number 3. This is not particularly a fantastically important one, but it's one to remember, and if you get this wrong, you'll find out straight away. Because the trigger operation itself, the program that's running, becomes part of the IO operation against the file, the application that is issuing the update, the write, the delete to the file will wait until the trigger program has finished before it gets control back. So if you've got an interactive order entry program, and as it writes the order away, at the end you've got a trigger on your order lines file, perhaps it calls the trigger once for each line that gets written. If that routine was running something that took 5 or 6 seconds to complete, then you would find you've got a delay of 5 or 6 seconds for every line that's on that order. And that could quickly mount up to an excessive delay of a minute every time it writes an order to the file. So what you do, well, really, your trigger, if it's going to take more than a second or two, should always submit the job that's going to process the actions. Okay, so you submit a job, and obviously preferably to a multi-threaded job queue. So all the trigger does is submit job, pass any parameters to it that you need to do, and that job can then go away and do the long-running tasks in the background. Now, you'll be happy to know that that is probably the end of the gotchas. So there's 3 big ones, but they're not really unwalkable. You can get around them. Once you get to triggers, you write your routines, you'll get around those quite easily. Okay, now once I've added a trigger to a file, I might want to delete it. Okay, there's a command to do that, which I'll show you shortly. But there's also a command called change physical file trigger. Now you can't actually change everything that you've defined in the trigger itself, but what you can change is the status down the bottom here, enabled and disabled. So it's where's trigger state enabled or disabled. This is a flag that the operating system will set against each trigger to say whether it's active or not. Okay, so you might have a trigger on a file that you're happily working away with, but all of a sudden for some reason you want to stop the trigger. You then just do a physical file trigger and say trigger state disabled. Okay. Unfortunately, again, you need to get an exclusive lock on the file for that to occur. Okay. But it's easier to do a change physical file trigger and disable it and then re-enable it when you want it to run again than it is to remove the trigger and actually add it back in again. It's a lot simpler. You don't have to remember all the trigger names and all that type of stuff. One thing to bear in mind here is if you've got a trigger on a file that ever gets cleared in your applications, if it is a clear PFM, that clear PFM will fail if you have an active trigger on the file. So you would need to change your application to do a physical file trigger, change the status to disabled before you do your clear PFM, and then add it back on again. Okay, each file can have up to 300 triggers attached to it. So you can willy-nilly add triggers to your file. You know, when a record is added, I want to process this business logic. When a record is updated, if these fields have changed, I want to do this business logic. When a record is added, I also want to do this business logic. So you can have up to 300 triggers. However, in our experience, that becomes quickly very, very unmanageable. And there's no reason really why you should ever have more than 7 triggers on a file. So you can have a before and after trigger for insert. You can have a before and after trigger for update. You can have a before and after trigger for delete. And you can have one trigger for read. And what you would do then, if you want to add more functionality when a record is inserted, instead of adding another trigger that calls a different program, you would change the original program to add the extra business logic in. So we can actually do 2 different things. My PC. Fine. Okay, so don't add triggers willy-nilly. Always keep the triggers manageable. Okay, so how do you write this application program now that will handle the data passed to you by the trigger on the operating system? Okay, the easiest way is just to write an RPG, COBOL, CL program, whatever you want to do to process the data. Now, how does your program get the data? Well, what happens is the operating system will pass to your program, so any program that you write to handle triggers always needs to have 2 parameters. The first parameter is a great big long string. Now, that string needs to be long enough to hold both the before and the after image of the record that you're going to be working with. So if your record length is 3,000, your string needs to be 6,000 plus about another couple of hundred characters to hold the control information. And it will also pass you another field, a second parameter, which is just a binary field, 4-digit binary field. It tells you how long that string is that's been passed to you. Okay, so what happens in this data string? Well, at the beginning of the data string, you've got these 5 fields to start with. So right at the beginning, in the first 10 characters of the data passed to you, you've got the name of the file being triggered and the library of the file being triggered. Now, if you only had one trigger program per file, you wouldn't really need to use that. But if you take my approach where you have a generic trigger program, that information would obviously decide which other program you call to process the logic for the trigger. Okay, and the next 10 characters tell you the member being triggered. The next character tells you which event has caused the trigger to occur. If that character is a 1, it's an insert. If that character is a 2, it's a delete. If the character is a 3, it's an update. If the character is a 4, it's a read from the file. So again, you can define your logic according to what kind of trigger has occurred. And the next character, position 32, tells you the time that that trigger has occurred. Okay, is it before the record is actually physically updated on the file, or is it after? Okay, you get some more information there. After that, the CCS ID of the file may be relevant if you've got multi-language applications. It'll also give you the relative record number of the file that's been processed, which can be handy to get back to the data if you want to. But the next 4 fields are the most interesting ones of the lot, and these are the ones that you need to do. This gives you a 4-byte binary field, the first one, that tells you whereabouts in that string the before image of the record, before the record was updated, starts. Where that record starts in your buffer that's passed to the program. The next 4 characters are the length of the before record, i.e. if it says it starts in byte 120, and it could be 2000 long, so it'll go from 120 to 2119. So that's how your program has to extract the data. And the next sets of fields are offset to the after image of the record and the length of the after record. Now obviously for an insert you won't have a before image, so you'll find the offset there is set to 0. Likewise, for a delete, you won't have an after image, so the offset there will be set to 0. So your program needs to be clever enough to know which strings exist depending on the function of the trigger that you're performing. So once you've defined those fields in a data structure, in the string, to extract the original record is very, very easy. This is how you do it in RPG. You just say eval org record equals percentage substring of the buffer, starting at the offset you've told me for the length. And the new record, again, starting at that buffer position, new offset and the length. I'm actually going to show you an RPG program that does all this in a second, well, in a minute. And if anybody wants to have a copy of that program, there's more. We've got no problem in sending that to you whatsoever. And that's what I talked about before, about having a generic program to access the file to decide which program you want to call. So if you're using the standard methodology that we recommend, one generic program from the trigger calls your actual logic program that you defined. And then the generic program can pass into your actual journal program, your trigger program, not your journal program, the username, the trigger event, the time, before and after, and the before and after string. And just that's the only data really that you'll find your trigger program really needs. Okay, now the easiest way to process this data in an RPG program makes it really, really easy. If you define these 2 data structures here, a before record structure as an external data structure, and if you put external name and then the name of the file, and obviously that file needs to be in your library just when you compile your trigger program, and you put a prefix B underscore, what that means is all the fields from your before image will be valid in that program with a prefix of B underscore. So if you've got a field called customer, or custno, in your program, in the trigger program you'll have a field called B underscore custno and also a field called A underscore custno. So in the logic in your program you can just check if A custno equals B custno. So you know whether the trigger updated that field or not. And that's just a visual confirmation of that. So we can have a B underscore balance and B underscore numords. Could be 2 fields from that file. And I would then have A underscore balance and A underscore numords for the after image of those fields on the file. None of this is a compulsory methodology of working. It's just the way that we found makes it easier to define the logic within the program. Two external data structures, put a prefix before them, then you'll get all the fields for all the files. The beauty of that is, of course, if your file ever changes because it's an external data structure, you just recompile your trigger program and all the offsets to the fields within the program will be correct again. So, the last trigger command that's provided by the operating system is this command here called print trigger programs. One of the things that's quite hard, I think, on iSeries to find is all the files that you've kept triggers on. Okay, you probably keep your own documentation, so you know all the triggers you created against all your tables and all your files on the machine. But if you ever want the operating system to tell you what they all are, the easiest way is to do this print trigger program. So if you do print trigger program asterisk all, that will generate you a report of all the files on the system and what all the triggers are. Okay. If you want more detailed information about the triggers, if you do a dispfd and put your file name and library name in there, and the type of information on the third box down is *trg, that will give you details of the trigger information against the file. All the parameters, is it before or after, is it on an insert, is it on a delete, is it enabled, everything you want to know about it. So obviously if you wanted lots of information about all the triggers on all the files on your system, you could do a dispfd *all type trig and put it to a file. In which case, it'd run for a long time, but you'd have all the information built up about all the triggers that you want to do. Okay. Now, just to reinforce what I've shown you there, I'm just going to show you on our machine how we create a trigger on a file. Okay, I've got a little application. The example trigger program that I've written for today is a real life one. It's probably the one I first ever used when we started using triggers. Imagine that we want to perform some action whenever a customer exceeds his credit limit. So he's placed an order, but he's got such a lot of invoices outstanding that the new order will take him over his credit limit. So the example we're going to do is we're actually going to email to our customer services department a list of all his outstanding invoices so they can make some kind of action. Okay, so I've got a program called trug001, but the first thing I'm going to do is add a trigger to the file. But just to prove that there's nothing there already, my file that holds my account balances is a file called custbals in my library UTI PA demo. Now I'm using DFU just to reinforce that the thing I said before, doesn't matter which program, which routine updates the file, the trigger will always occur. So if I update my file, my customer is SCO1, which is my customer in our system. Okay, I've just got one field on this file, so it's that saying his current balance is £1,200,000, no it's not, it's £12,500 and no pence. Now the credit limit on my file is actually £10,000, so it's actually over the credit limit at the moment, but that doesn't matter. See, if I update that record, nothing happened. It just DFU updated the record. And I'm going to add a trigger onto the file which will cause some logic to occur. Now I'm going to do what I told you not to do, and I'm going to run this interactively just for the sake of demonstration. So what am I going to do? I'm going to add a trigger to my file called custbals, and it's in library UTI PA demo. My trigger time is going to be after, so after the record is updated, I want the trigger to fire. I'm not sure I like that word, but that's what IBM call it, so we'll call it trigger fire. And what event do I want this trigger to occur? I want it to occur when the file is updated. I'm not interested when a record's added or when a record's deleted, because the only time a customer will go over his credit limit is when this is actually updated, unless he puts lots of orders in when he first starts, of course. Now what am I going to call when the trigger fires? I'm going to call a program called trug001, and it's in library UTI PA demo. Okay, that's it. I've set the defaults for everything else. So when I press enter now, it says trigger added to physical file. So now there's a trigger that's going to occur. Now if I DFU that file again, F9 to bring back my DFU command. Now if I update the file again. See, if I change that customer balance now to be 11,500, when I press enter, watch down the bottom because you'll see some status messages because the application is going to run is actually calling the status messages. So you see, it was very, very quick, but it said building a file and sending the file down to a PC. Basically what we're doing here is calling one of our own applications. I'll do it one more time just so you can see it. Be eagle-eyed. I'm not quite sure whether the GoToWebinar software actually made that visible to you or not. Oh yeah, you can see it. You can see it down the bottom. So that's actually running the application in the background. Now what we've done is like I said, we've run a Route 1 application. I'll just quickly show you the program, how it looks. Oops. So those of you who are not RPG type people, look away now. So basically this is the program that trigger called, okay? So there's the input buffer I've got and the buffer length. I've got up here a data structure over the string so I can work out where the data starts, the length of the data, where the data ends, and the length of the data. I've got my before and after image for my data structures. So they'll prefix all the names of B underscore and A underscore. I'm doing something interesting here because my customer credit limit is actually held on a different file. So my trigger, although it's getting all the data from my customer balance file, it doesn't know at that point whether they're over the credit limit or not. So it's actually going to the customer's file to access his credit limit. So the logic here is, and this is quite an important thing to remember, the file I'm going to link to within my RPG program I've defined as user open, because what you've got to think here is this trigger could be fired from any job that ever updates this table. Okay. Whereas you might think your library list will be right for all your applications, I guarantee you'll find something that runs somewhere where the library list is not correct for updating one file, and your files are going to be not in the library list where the trigger occurs, so you'll get an error. So the way around that is to define user open against the files, and then override the files to where you want it to be, and then open it manually. Okay, and that's there. It's passing the data from the string, and you see here now I've built a key list up to go to my customer file. My customer file's got 3 keys on it. It's got a company code, a customer number, and a delivery sequence. Now, the fields I'm using to go to the file are my after image of the company code, my after image of the customer number, and my after image of the delivery sequence. Okay. Now, presumably, my application won't let me change the company or the customer or the delivery sequence. If it did, it would be very, very dangerous. So, in this case, I could have used before image or whatever. And then my logic just says, as long as I've found a record on the customer file, and the current balance, the after image of the current balance from the trigger is greater than the credit limit on the file, then I want to build up a command. And I've built up a command to run Route 1, which is one of our products which will download data for you. And basically it's saying run a Route 1 command called open invoices, and it's passed to that command 3 fields, the after company, the after customer number, and the after delivery sequence. And that's all it does, and it sets on LR to end the program. So when the trigger occurs, it ran that program, which in itself called a Route 1 request. So what's happened here now, if I go into my Outlook, I should have a couple of emails. I've done it twice. So here you are. The trigger executed a routine, added extra logic into my ERP system without me changing the ERP system itself, and it sent me an email to say this customer has exceeded the credit limit. Obviously, in that email, I could have been more specific about the customer code and the name and all that type of stuff. But it's also attached to that email a spreadsheet of all the open invoices. So this is saying, so I can quite easily make a quick decision. This customer's got 13 open invoices. Those are the dates and the values. I can either chase him up and get some money off him, or I can just suspend the order, whatever I need to do in my business processes. Now, it's really just to show you how quick and easy it was to run a routine. Okay, now then, if you're not techie, you might be saying, well, I can't do that. I can't write RPG code, and I can't write triggers. Now, there is a way that we have, a product that we have that will automate that for you and make it very easy. Now, this will also incorporate all the tips and techniques that we've defined. And this is a product called Proactive. Now, Proactive will let you define your triggers within it and your business rules and what you want to happen. Okay, and it will manage all the triggers for you. It will generate the programs to do the trigger actions. So it takes it completely out of your hands and makes it very, very easy. Another advantage, of course, is you can see all the triggers that are in place in the system all in one place. Okay, so you don't have to do a trigger and all that kind of stuff. And what you do here, to make my trigger occur, basically I just do a start and end. So that does you add physical file trigger, remove physical file trigger, enable, disable, all that type of stuff. But then all you do is you just define actions against the trigger. Okay. I can here specify joints. So to illustrate the concept I had before, I'm going to my customer file to get more information. And you just define the joints there. Oops, sorry, I pressed the wrong function key. But to define the actions I want to occur, I do it here. So what am I doing? I'm sending an email. It's going to be a command. I only want to do it on an update. And I've said here, this is my logic, if the after image of the current balance is greater than the credit limit, I want to run that command and substitute the fields in from my image into the command. So that's how I do it quite easily in the product. And then when I put a what in there, that would generate the data program to go away and do it. That makes it quite simple, an easy way of doing it, but obviously you need to have our product to do it that way. That is the end of the first demo.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. I think it's fair to say that in the first part, we covered a tremendous amount, from adding and amending, including input, output parameters, and calling programs. There's a lot to take in there. But thankfully, we're recording the webinar, so you'll be free to review pertinent parts at a time of your choice. Hurrah! Now then, what about some advanced functionality? We spoke at the start about workflows and virtual terminals, but so far, not a peep. Well, now in part 2, we'll introduce these processes and more. Now, as we've demonstrated, using simple triggers can help automate your enterprise. But what if we want to add intelligence, perhaps add some rules behind what path to take or trigger to use depending upon values, date range, flag status, and more? Well, thankfully, there's a native IBM I solution that allows you to do this with aplomb, and today we'll be introducing you to Proactive. Proactive provides an easy-to-use method of improving business processes and workflow without modifying existing core business systems. Now, this technology is built upon the underlying trigger foundations that we introduced at the beginning of the webinar and allows users to implement an intelligent approach to workflow automation. While triggers are a fantastic way to activate a program or event, Proactive allows us to push this process forward by building a workflow or cascade of workflows to suit best practice or bespoke processes. The rules engine will allow you to apply logic to events to trigger, launch, depending upon values or variables. Security and integrity is paramount when deploying and managing automation, so we include process monitoring, audit trail, and a complete history. But that's not all. We can enjoy an integrated virtual terminal that can take results from actions and enter these values through the green screen. So we're not just automating processes under the surface, we're also automating data input. But more on this just a little later. So how do businesses implement workflow technology? Well, let's just take a classic example of implemented workflow from the warehouse. Now, typically, a warehouse likes to implement a minimum order quantity. In this particular case, we've implemented a rule for monitoring particular items, but rules could be implemented globally or specifically to subclasses. I mean, the options are yours. So, if X stock levels are less than 3, then activate workflow Y. Workflow Y simply activates a program. I mean, in this case, just as Steve demonstrated a couple of minutes ago, it's for route 1 to build a purchase requisition request and automatically email the request to the purchasing manager for approval. It's clean and easy to implement, simple but very powerful. But that's not the end of it. You may remember that I mentioned that we can build cascades of workflows. So again, expanding on the example from the previous slide, we've added a precursory rule to engage what could be considered as dangerous levels. So in this case, we're saying if minimum order quantity is less than 1, then we need to go down a different workflow. In this example, we're interrogating the authorized supplier file and analyzing cost to purchase against lead time. So if the situation wasn't critical and we had more stock to satisfy the order we received, then you'd probably add rules to say go for supplier A with the lowest cost but longest lead time. But as the workflow has been activated on the minimum order quantity being less than 1, and we've probably interrogated the existing order variables and added those into the equation too, then we're going to choose supplier B with the highest purchase price but critical quickest lead times. Now at this point, Proactive automatically instructs the program, and again in this case it's route 1, to extract the details from the database, merge data with the purchase order form, transform to a PDF and email the order with a copy of to the stores and or purchasing manager. Or we could not do that and deliver the purchase order digitally via XML to the supplier. Again, it's a simple rule that you could add. On receipt of goods, perhaps you scan the barcode or use digital signatures. Proactive is monitoring for these and updates the goods received and notifies the store manager by email immediately on receipt, live. Now, this is a basic common area of automation, but I wanted to provide you with a pertinent example that you yourselves could extrapolate ideas from. But let's take you through how this is done. I'd like to bring back Steve, who will give you a demonstration on how we can do more of this through Proactive, in fact. Welcome back.
Thanks, Andy. I'm just going to build on what I showed you in Proactive before. Proactive will let you automate all the trigger logic that we talked about before. But because it's a workflow product more than just triggers, there's lots of other functionality in there to help you automate your workflow. I'm just going to walk you through one example, which is a real-life example with the names and faces changed, if you know what I mean. What happens here, we've got an example where a purchase order is created on a customer's FTP site. So when they want to buy something from us, excuse me, they will write a purchase order XML document onto their FTP site. And we want to automatically pull this into our ERP system on the I-Series. We have a product called iRoute, which is not really what I'm going to talk about today, but this is the methodology I'm going to use. So if I copy that purchase order file, and over here I've got a Windows Explorer session, which is actually pointing to our FTP site. So I just paste it into there. So that's simulating the arrival of a purchase order on an FTP site. Then what happens is our product called iRoute, wrong product, will monitor that FTP site and pull the data down. So what we do is we create a script on here that will parse the data and pass it to tell it where to put the data on the AS400. Then we also tell it where to look for the data. So we go into Web and File Detection Settings here. So basically we're saying when a file arrives at a particular place and it's called this, this, and this, I want to run that script. So rather than it waiting 20 minutes for it to find the next file, if I just click Check Now, what will happen is, he says, hopefully, that should trigger the iRoute program to read the data, upload it to the AS400, and then process it automatically. So the beauty of this is things are happening automatically in the background that we don't necessarily know about. So by the action of a customer placing an XML document on their own FTP server, we can get that data into our ERP system seamlessly and without any manual intervention at all. So just quickly go to that, upload, just make sure it's works. Yeah, so that's saying at 154307, that data was uploaded to the I-Series. Okay, now in this case, the iRoute product has just written that to a flat file. So how do we get that from the flat file into our ERP system? Well, the beauty of this is the proactive product contains what we call a virtual terminal session. This is a Kia session. Basically, we call it IKEA. So it's Kia for the I. What this will do, it will read that file that's been created and it will run a script against it. So as a post-processing program in the upload, we've said run this virtual terminal script, this IKEA script. If I show you the script, I won't take it too long in this. I'll just quickly show you the methodology that it works. A script is always held in a source member, and basically what we're saying here is we're programming the keystrokes into this script and telling it how to run the application. So we recognize in the screen, and then we must say we want to call the purchase order entry program, and then we tell it where to key the fields in from the file onto the green screen and press enter. But the quickest way, if you like, to make this come alive is to look at the IKEA history. So keep an audit log of everything it's done. So just myself placing that XML document onto our FTP site triggered the upload of the file to the 400 and then the virtual terminal session to kick in. And what it's done is it's read that file and keyed it in through our existing ERP system. So this is just the product signing on to a green screen session. Okay, setting the libraries right. And then it's calling the purchase order entry program. So this is a regular, okay, it's a pretend program, but this is like an ERP system. So the script tells me to read a record from the file. So it's keyed the supply number into that field, the date there, and the buyer code. And then it takes me into the detail entry. So now I press enter, and again it's read the data from the file, so it's added all the fields in, keyed all the fields in for me manually there. Press enter, it puts it up at the top of the subfile. Typical order entry task, purchase order entry task. Now you can put quite sophisticated logic in here. What we want to do in our application is every time after we've written a line, added a line, we always want to change the text. So by a few if statements we can say, put the 2 in the right box there, and then key text against it. So it's like comments against the purchase order. So 3 processor, 2 terabyte hard drive, and a hardcore processor. A dual core processor. Okay, so we've got another line there, and again, it's put a text against the line. And that's it really. So then it's pressed enter, it's got to the end and says, the application wants me to press F8 to accept, so it always tells you what key you've pressed at the top there, and I pressed F8 to accept. And then I pressed F3 to come out of the application, and then I typed 90, and I signed off, which got me back to my iSeries logon screen. So that's another example of how you can automate processes. By a user, an external user, performing some action, data arrives in your ERP system. And because it's gone through your own ERP system interface, it's been fully validated. You're not having to reinvent the wheel to get the data in there.
Thank you very much, Steve. And what we saw there, although Steve took you through it step by step, every part of that was automated. So there was no manual intervention. It just went in quickly, simply. It was automated, which is what today is all about, really. So during that demonstration, Steve spoke about workflows and indeed the concepts of having embedded workflows to do some pretty fancy stuff as with IKEA. And it sounds complex, but it really isn't. We use the integrated rules engine to set up parameters for what happens, when and how. We monitor the database and trigger events and workflows depending upon certain values or instances or existence. From here we can execute programs using before and after images, parse information, complete calculations, everything you need to complete integrated workflow without modification to the existing core application. It's like having the advantage of a bespoke application without bespoking whatsoever. Steve also spoke about IKEA, the rather appropriately named virtual terminal, that allows us to automate data entry through green screen using after image data from external files, or indeed other integrated databases or data sources. IKEA can be a standalone product or integrated within other automations such as integration tools from standard trigger use or more advanced programs such as iRoot and Proactive. The beauty of this solution is that we can replicate the data processing power of multiple administrators. So if you have people tapping away at the green screen, entering order information, creating multi-level bills and materials, amending purchase requisitions or the like, then this should be on your radar. Not only can we streamline the process, but we're also removing what we call pilot error through the removal of manual intervention. This improves accuracy while adding security with full audit trail facilities. I mean, not only this, but it's easy to script too. In addition, we have a record facility to, well, record and play back in the script language what we've just completed. Again, just speeding up the development time. And an example of this is perhaps with the example that Steve showed earlier, but if you have a user out in the field, perhaps he's a sales guy or a service engineer, he completes all his stuff on the on a spreadsheet and emails that in or places it onto his own part of a network folder onto the network directory. Now, our product iRoot is automatically monitoring these folders, and it picks up the spreadsheet, or it picks up and extracts the file attachment from the email and extracts it to the IBM I. It'll run the validation procedures, and on success, it'll update the database. And Root 1 can then email that user back saying, great, it's all been updated and all the information has been passed correctly. Now, if it does fail for whatever reason, we have one of two choices. We can email that back and not pass any of the information, but within the attachment, within that spreadsheet, in big bold red letters saying, this is a reason why it failed, please check and resubmit. Or we can say, well, we'll pass the information that's been successful, but just ask him to resubmit that one cell that's been done. Now, we have a number of ways of interfacing that with the database. We can interface directly itself using the own validation routines in iRoot itself. We can go through the interface files, perhaps if you're using an import ERP system or the like that has its own interface files. We'll go through those. But more common than not, the preferred path to go through is to say, well, actually, I don't want to go through the interface files. What I prefer to do is to take this data and use IKEA and enter all this information directly through the green screen. So when we're not interfering with any of the Infor or the ERP providers' rules or interfaces, we're just doing things as if we're a person, but we're automating that process itself. So what we do is we give you the ability to be flexible, add choice. And Steve, you've been implementing this type of technology with businesses for over 20 years now. I mean, perhaps you could provide 2 or 3 real-life examples.
Yeah, I've got a few here in the presentation. One of the obvious ones, and it's now so easy to implement by using triggers, is to create audit logs of any changes to fields on files. So with a trigger, and Proactive will automate this for you, but doing it yourself is very easy. As you've seen, you can just attach a trigger to a file, and in the logic program you can check for any fields that you want to monitor if it's been changed. Okay. A real life example that we had is because one of our customers got burnt, is you monitor your supplier file and monitor the bank details. So whenever the bank details change on a supplier, you want to know about it, because this particular customer had something fraudulent in the department that changed the bank details to what they shouldn't have been. So you can do that within the product. Audit is very easy to do. Some other examples that are quite easy to implement. For example, one customer wanted, whenever a new customer placed an order, they wanted to send them a welcome letter and give them a 10% discount on receipt of the first order. So without having to change the ERP system whatsoever, by adding a trigger onto the file, a trigger before the update occurred, is the trigger program would look on the order file and say, is there an order for this customer? If not, it then generates the trigger, sends them a welcome letter, and it then adds a 10% discount onto the bottom of the order as a line. So without changing your application, it can do that type of stuff. And one that I mentioned earlier on before is quite a good one as well. Take this out of your application. Because you'll find you've got order entry, you've got order amend, you've got lots of probably routines that will change orders. If you wanted to implement all of a sudden a minimum order charge, or you wanted to put delivery charges based on total order value, rather than having to go and change the logic in lots of different places, you can just add a trigger onto the file. So the trigger, when an order is placed, it could read the order file, determine if it or not it was above the minimum order value. If so, it would just do nothing. If not, it would add on a delivery charge by generating an order line for delivery charge. So triggers can be used to enforce your business rules without changing your ERP system. And the beauty of it is all in one place. So if your business rules change, you only have to change one program.
Thank you very much, Steve. So in a short space of time, we hope you've learned how to utilize triggers. For those who've already dabbled with this technology, we hope we provided you with examples on how to improve your processes. And finally, for advanced users or for those who would like to implement complete workflow automation, we've introduced some powerful but simple to implement technologies that can do all this for you and more. Now, if you missed any of the session, don't worry, we've recorded this webinar and it's available to you and will be available to you as of the same time tomorrow. Again, thank you for joining us. This presentation is a joint Utilities 400 Ask Bob production. Utilities 400 are a premier IBM ISV that specialise in developing robust, integrated and intelligent solutions, and Ask Bob, or Ask Best of Breed for IBM Power I, is a newly formed group of best-of-breed IBM I business partners, consultants and ISVs providing advice and best practice through knowledge, experience and a range of best-in-class solutions and services. My name is Andrew Nicholson. I was joined by Steve Close. Before we close out this session, we'll open the next couple of minutes for questions. And I have one here from Brian. Brian asks, if you can copy your database file, does the trigger and action get copied too?
Right. Good question, and that's one that gets asked quite a lot. The answer is, if you take a file and you do a copy file on it to create a copy of the data in another library, then no, the trigger does not go across with the file. If you create a new file with a create duplicate object command, then by default it will take the trigger with it. However, if you're on version 6 and above, you can specify on the create object command whether you want the trigger to be replicated onto the target file or not. Again, if you save and restore the object, you restore the file to a different library, the trigger would be on that file as well. So it's something to be aware of.
Okay. And finally, one from Mark. Do you have to write a program to perform the logic for a trigger?
You have to write some logic. Yeah, you don't actually have to do it in a high-level language such as RPG or COBOL. As well as using triggers from programs the way we've done it, you can also use the embedded inbuilt SQL support from OS 400 to do triggers that way. There are commands called create triggers, change triggers, delete triggers, perform exactly the same function. And then instead of writing code, you can actually execute a stored procedure to perform the logic if you want. So yeah, you have to write the logic, but it's not necessarily a program. It could be a stored procedure.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for all who joined us today. This has been an Ask Bob, a Utilities 400 production. Should you wish to contact us, the contact details are on there. You'll receive a recording of this webinar through your email, same time tomorrow. Next session for the Ask Bob production will be everything you wanted to know about high availability but were afraid to ask. Registration details will be forwarded to you. Until now, and thank you again, and until next time, goodbye.
Bye-bye.